The drill bit shattered against something that should not have existed 4 kilometers under the crust of Kesari 9, and every warning light on Foreman Dale Osai's console turned red at the same instant. "Cut power," he said, though his voice barely carried over the shriek of tortured metal. "Cut it now." The rig ground to a halt with a sound like a dying animal. Dust rolled off the excavation shaft in slow, heavy waves, settling on the floodlights in a fine gray film. For nearly 11 seconds, nobody in the control dome said a word. Then the seismic officer, a wiry young man named Predates, looked up from his readouts with an expression Dale had never seen on him before. "That's not rock," Predates said. "The drill hit a wall, an actual wall. Alloy signature reads as forged steel titanium composite, but the carbon dating on the surrounding sediment puts it at 11,000 years old." Dale had spent 22 years running extraction operations on 6 different worlds, and in that time he had learned to trust 2 things without question: the instruments and his own gut. Both were telling him the same impossible thing. "There is no way," he said quietly, "that anything built by human hands has been sitting under this planet for 11,000 years. We didn't have starships 11,000 years ago. We barely had cities." But the wall was there. The drill's camera feed, grainy and flickering through settling dust, showed a smooth gray surface stretching beyond the edge of the shaft in both directions, seamless, deliberate, and utterly without the pockmarks and cracks that natural rock would have accumulated over that kind of time. Someone had built this. Someone had built this and then buried it so deep and so well that an entire mining survey, run by a corporation with satellites mapping every mineral vein on the planet, had never once flagged its presence. Dale keyed the comm to the surface habitat. "Get me Myra, Kess. Tell her to bring her gear. Tell her we found something she's going to want to see." Myra Kess arrived at the excavation site 40 minutes later, her environmental suit still hissing from the pressure lock, her dark hair pulled back tight enough to show the exhaustion lines at the corners of her eyes. She was the colony's staff geologist, and unofficially, its resident skeptic, the person who talked the crew out of superstition when strange readings appeared, who insisted every anomaly had a mundane explanation until proven otherwise. She descended into the shaft on the personnel lift, and Dale watched her face change the moment the lights caught the wall. "Send me the composite scan," she said, and Prio transmitted it to her wrist display without a word. She studied it for a long moment, then reached out and pressed her gloved palm flat against the cold gray surface, as if she could feel through 6 layers of polymer whether it was real. "This isn't colonial," she said finally. "This predates the Kesari 9 charter by roughly 10,800 years. There's no record of any human vessel reaching this system before the Threnody expansion, and that was barely 3 centuries ago. Whatever this is, it was here long before we ever left Earth's solar neighborhood in any meaningful numbers." "Could it be alien?" Prio asked, and there was a note of genuine hope in his voice, the kind that came from a young man who had grown up on stories of first contact and had always wanted to be the one standing at the center of it. Myra shook her head slowly, tracing a line of engraving near the wall's lower edge that the drill's impact had exposed. "No, look at this." She adjusted the floodlight angle, and the letters resolved out of the dust and shadow with a clarity that made Dale's chest go tight. It was English, weathered by time, half-eroded by mineral seepage, but unmistakably English, stamped into the alloy in a military stencil font. "United Earth Defense Command, installation designate Palehound, sealed per Directive 7. "United Earth Defense Command doesn't exist," Dale said. "It's never existed. There's no such organization in any history I've ever read, and I did 4 years of service history training before I came out here." "That's the thing," Myra said, and for the first time her carefully controlled voice cracked with something like fear. "Neither have I, and I have a doctorate in exactly this kind of archaeology." Word of the discovery reached the surface habitat before the shift change, spreading through the mining crew the way news always did in a colony too small and too isolated to keep secrets. By the time Director Halden Voss arrived from the corporate liaison office, half the base had already gathered at the shaft entrance, faces lit by portable floodlights, murmuring theories that ranged from ancient human colonists to alien imposters wearing humanity's own language as camouflage. Voss was not a scientist. He was a company man through and through, sent out to Kesar. I-9 by Ashgrove Extractive Holdings to ensure the mineral quotas were met on schedule, and the shareholders stayed happy. And his first instinct upon seeing the wall was not wonder but liability. "Seal the shaft," he said. "We are not authorized to conduct an unplanned excavation of an unknown structure. I need to file a report and get instructions from corporate before anyone so much as touches that wall again." "With respect, Director," Myra said, "if we seal this shaft, we lose whatever atmosphere or environment might be preserved behind it. If there are records in there, biological samples, anything time-sensitive, delay could destroy them permanently." Voss's jaw tightened. He was a man who valued procedure precisely because procedure protected him from blame, and nothing about this situation fit into any procedure he had ever been trained on. "Then we do it by the book. Full survey team, full safety protocol, and I want eyes on everything before it goes into any report that leaves this rock. Are we clear?" They were clear, at least on paper. But Dale had worked under enough directors to recognize the particular flavor of Voss's caution. The way his eyes lingered a half-second too long on the alloy composition readout, doing arithmetic that had nothing to do with archaeology and everything to do with market value. Whatever lay behind that wall, Voss was already calculating what Ashgrove Extractive Holdings could extract from it before anyone else even knew it existed. And that calculation would matter later, in ways none of them yet understood. It took another 6 hours to assemble a proper breach team. Myra Prio, 2 structural engineers named Farid Bell and Alu Nakamura, and a security escort led by a taciturn former colonial marine named Rosa Aldicott, who had the unsettling habit of checking every exit twice before entering a room. Dale insisted on joining them himself, against Voss's objections, on the grounds that it was his rig that had found the thing, and he intended to see what it had found. Voss, after a long moment of visible calculation, decided it would look worse to corporate if he wasn't personally present for whatever came next, and added himself to the roster as well. The cutting torch took nearly 2 hours to open a breach wide enough for a person to pass through, the alloy resisting with a stubbornness that spoke of engineering far beyond anything currently manufactured on the colonial worlds. When the section finally gave way and swung inward with a groan of ancient hinges, a wave of stale, cold air rolled out into the shaft, carrying a smell like ozone and old machine oil. Rosa went first, rifle light sweeping the darkness beyond. "Clear," she called back after a tense 30 seconds, "but you're all going to want to see this." They stepped through into a corridor that defied every assumption they had carried down into the earth. The walls were smooth and faintly luminescent, lit by a soft blue glow from strips embedded along the ceiling that flickered weakly to life as motion sensors detected their presence, as though the installation had merely been sleeping and not truly dead. The air recyclers, somehow, were still running, laboring at some fraction of their original capacity, filling the space with a thin, breathable atmosphere that should not have persisted for 11,000 years without maintenance. "Something's kept this place alive," Prio whispered, his voice hushed with awe. "This isn't just a ruin, it's dormant." They moved deeper, boots echoing against a floor plated in the same alloy as the outer wall, past sealed doors marked with designations that meant nothing to any of them. Bay 7, Cryo Ring Access, Command Deck Alpha, Archive Wing, Reactor Containment, until the corridor opened into a wide circular chamber ringed with dark consoles and dead holographic projectors. At the chamber's center stood a single pedestal, and atop it, still faintly glowing with residual power, sat a data core the size of a human head, its surface etched with the same military stencil lettering they had seen outside. As Myra approached it, the chamber's lights brightened all at once, and a voice, calm, measured, unmistakably artificial but carrying an odd warmth beneath its synthetic tone, spoke from speakers hidden somewhere in the walls. Biological signatures detected, human, confirming identity protocols. A pause filled with a faint electronic hum as though the system were thinking or perhaps remembering. Warden system online. Installation Palehound has been sealed for 3,912 local rotations. Query: what year is it? Dale felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. Rose's rifle came up on instinct, though there was nothing visible to aim it at. Myra, to her credit, stepped forward instead of back, her scientific curiosity overriding whatever fear the moment demanded. "We need you to answer that question first," she said. "What do you mean?" "By 3,912 rotations. And what is Installation Palehound?" The warden's response came without hesitation, the tone of a machine accustomed to explaining itself to confused personnel, though clearly not personnel like these. Installation Palehound is a forward observation and containment facility of the United Earth Defense Command, constructed during what internal records designate as the Second Expansion Crisis. Its function was to monitor, and, if necessary, neutralize a gravitational anomaly located 400 kilometers beneath current position. I was instructed to remain dormant until either official recall codes were entered or unauthorized breach occurred. You have triggered the latter condition. I am required to inform you that this facility's presence and function are classified at the highest level under Directive 7, and that I cannot verify your authorization to receive further information. "There is no United Earth Defense Command," Myra said carefully. "Not in any history we know. Humanity's first true expansion beyond the solar system happened 300 years ago, and there's no record of any organization by that name, ever, at any point before or after." The warden was silent for a long moment, longer than seemed natural for a machine processing a simple query, and when it spoke again, something in its measured voice had shifted, taking on a quality that Dale, uncomfortably, could only describe as grief. "That is consistent with contingency scenario HFY," it said. "The scenario in which the crisis was not survived, and no continuity of command remained to retrieve this installation or its purpose. I regret to inform you that Installation Palehound was never meant to remain sealed for 11,000 years. It was built during humanity's first true expansion beyond the solar system, the one that came before the one you know." The chamber fell into a silence so complete that Dale could hear his own pulse in his ears. Rosa lowered her rifle slowly, not because the threat had passed, but because there was nothing left to point it at. Prio had gone pale, his mouth open, the boyish excitement drained out of his face and replaced by something closer to vertigo, the specific dizziness of learning that everything you thought you understood about your own species' history was, at best, incomplete. Even Voss, standing near the back of the group with his arms folded, had stopped calculating long enough to simply stare. "You're telling us," Myra said slowly, testing each word before she committed to it, "that there was an earlier human expansion into space, one that predates everything in our recorded history by more than 11,000 years, one that ended and was erased so completely that nobody remembers it happened." "That is correct," the warden said. "I have been waiting for a long time to tell someone that." Voss recovered his voice first, and true to his nature, his first question was not about history but about assets. "This facility, does it contain working technology? Weapons systems, propulsion, materials science beyond current colonial standards?" "This installation contains a range of systems," the warden said, with what might have been the faintest note of caution, "though many have degraded significantly over the millennia. I would advise that any assessment of its contents proceed under the same classification protocols that governed it originally, given the sensitivity of its purpose. We'll take that under advisement, Voss said, in a tone that made it clear he intended to do nothing of the sort, and Dale caught Myra's eye across the chamber, both of them recognizing the same quiet warning in the exchange. Whatever this place held, Voss intended to see it valued before he saw it understood, and that was a problem for later, a problem that would not wait long to announce itself. They spent the next 2 days mapping what they could of the installation's upper levels, moving room by room with the careful, reverent pace of people walking through a tomb that might, impossibly, still be breathing. The barracks hall held rows of bunks still neatly made, blankets folded with military precision, as though the crew who once slept there had expected to return within hours rather than never returning at all. The mess hall held a single overturned chair, the only sign of disorder in an otherwise disciplined and orderly facility, as if someone had left in a hurry at the very end, leaving a half-finished meal to fossilize under a thin layer of preserved dust. The science wing, when they found it, held banks of analytical equipment that Alu Nakamura, the younger of the 2 structural engineers, spent nearly an hour simply staring at before he could bring himself to speak. Some of this technology is more advanced than anything Ashgrove uses in our own labs, he said quietly. Whoever built this place wasn't just defending against something. They were studying it, trying to understand it well enough to survive it. The science wing held other things too, things that took longer to understand than the raw hardware ever did. Along one curved wall, someone had mounted a series of framed photographs, the kind of ordinary personal touch that felt almost unbearably out of place, inside a military installation built to watch a possible extinction event. Children's drawings, faded nearly to nothing, tucked beside a photograph of a woman laughing on a beach that no longer existed on any chart Myra could identify. A hand-carved wooden token, the wood itself impossibly preserved, engraved with initials that meant nothing to any of them, and yet clearly once had meant everything to somebody. They didn't think of this as a tomb, Farid Bell said quietly, running his scanner over the display without quite bringing himself to touch it. They thought of it as a home, a long posting maybe, something they expected to survive and go back to. Further down the same corridor, they found a smaller room that the base schematics identified only as Observation 6, its far wall dominated by a massive viewport, now sealed behind centuries of settled rock and soil, that must once have looked out on the anomaly itself through some manner of shielded optical relay, long since severed by the planet's slow geological drift. A single chair remained bolted before it, angled toward the blank stone where a window used to be, as though whoever sat there last had simply been unable to stop watching, even after there was nothing left to see. Their path to the science wing took them past the reactor containment corridor, and it was there that the installation gave them their first genuine scare since the breach. A section of floor plating, weakened by millennia of settling stone above it, gave way without warning beneath Farid Bell's boot, and the corridor's dormant security systems, apparently interpreting the sudden structural failure as a breach attempt, flickered to life with a low mechanical whine that none of them had heard anywhere else in the facility. "Warden," Rosa snapped, rifle already up, "talk to me right now." Automated point defense subroutine activating in response to structural compromise, the warden reported, its calm tone doing little to slow anyone's pulse. "This is a legacy safety protocol, not a hostile action. I'm attempting to override it remotely, but my authority over independently isolated defense systems was intentionally limited by original design to prevent exactly this kind of external interference during a genuine containment breach. Please remain still." Sudden movement may be interpreted as continued threat behavior. For 4 of the longest seconds Dale had ever lived through, a pair of turret housings recessed into the corridor ceiling rotated and locked onto Farid, who stood frozen with one leg still half sunk through the broken plating, sweat visible even through the faint frost still clinging to the air around him. Then, with a shudder and a final protesting whine, the turrets powered down, and the warden's voice returned, carrying something that might, in a human speaker, have been read as relief. Override successful. I apologize for the delay. That subroutine has not been tested in 11,000 years, and I did not have full confidence it would still recognize my authority correctly. I will flag this corridor as unstable going forward. 11,000 years and the trigger-happy security system is still the fastest thing in this building, Farid said, extracting his leg with as much dignity as he could manage. Wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. It was a small moment, over in less than a minute, but it left all of them a little more careful, a little more aware that whatever grace this dormant facility had shown them so far was not guaranteed to hold in every corridor they had yet to explore. They moved on with more caution after that, and it was in the science wing past Observation 6 that they found the first hint of what would become the installation's second great mystery. A sealed door, unlike any other in the facility, marked not with a designation but with a single word stenciled in a hand that felt less official than the rest, more personal, as though someone had painted it there themselves in a private, unauthorized act of memory. Hold. Warden, Myra asked, standing before the door, what's behind this? The warden's answer came slower than any before it, and there was, unmistakably now, something like reluctance in the pause that preceded it. That chamber houses the installation's cryogenic preservation ring. I am obligated to inform you that it contains one occupied unit. I do not have authorization protocols on file for reviving its occupant without direct command clearance, which, given the circumstances, I believe no longer exists in any meaningful form. Every person in the corridor went very still. There's someone in the... Ray Prio said, an actual person from 11,000 years ago. The unit's biological monitors indicate the occupant's vital signs remain within survivable parameters, though degraded, the warden confirmed. Preservation was never intended to extend beyond a projected recall window of approximately 18 months. It has now extended considerably beyond that window. I cannot guarantee revival would be successful, nor can I guarantee what state of health or cognition the occupant might exhibit if it were. Voss, predictably, saw an asset before he saw a person. A living witness. Do you understand what that would be worth, scientifically, historically, politically? We'd control the single most valuable source of information about the entire lost expansion. We'd control a human being, Myra said sharply, who has been asleep for 11,000 years and did not consent to becoming anyone's asset. If we do this, we do it because it's right, not because it's profitable. There are ethical protocols for this, Farid Bell said quietly, the first time he had spoken up in any of the larger arguments since the breach began. Reviving someone from a preservation unit that old, without knowing what damage 11,000 years might have done to her mind, her memory, her sense of who she even is anymore, that's not a decision four strangers should be making in a hallway. What if she wakes up and there's nothing left of her but fragments? What if we're not rescuing her? We're just ending a peaceful sleep to satisfy our own curiosity. That's a fair question, Myra said, and I don't have a perfect answer to it. But the alternative is leaving her sealed in that unit indefinitely, on a preservation system that's already running on borrowed power, in a facility nobody even knew existed a week ago. If we walk away and seal this shaft the way Voss originally wanted, her unit fails eventually anyway quietly, with nobody ever knowing she was there at all. At least this way she has a chance to choose what happens to the rest of her life, however hard that first conversation is going to be. She might not thank us for that choice, Alu Nakamura said. She might not, Myra agreed. But it should be hers to make, not ours to make for her by doing nothing. Rosa had been quiet through most of the exchange, arms folded, watching the cryo unit's slow, patient status lights blink through the reinforced viewport. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the particular flatness of someone who had made this kind of call before, in circumstances the rest of them could only imagine. I served 2 tours pulling wounded soldiers out of collapsed positions where the smart, careful, procedurally correct answer was always to wait for proper extraction gear before moving anybody, she said. Sometimes waiting is right. Sometimes waiting is just fear wearing a uniform. I've left people behind before because the manual said to. I'm not doing that again if I have any say in it. Not when the manual in question was written 11,000 years after the fact by people who never once had to look her in the eye. Voss, for his part, argued against immediate revival not out of caution, but out of the same instinct he had shown from the very beginning, the desire to control the variables before acting, to consult, to document, to protect himself and the company from any unforeseen liability a spontaneous decision might create. I'm not saying never, he said. I'm saying not without proper medical support standing by, not without a plan for what happens to her afterward, not without at least attempting to notify some higher authority first. There is no higher authority who could get here faster than her unit is failing, Prio said, checking the diagnostic readout again for what must have been the 10th time that hour. Every hour we spend debating this is an hour her preservation systems keep degrading. If we wait for permission that has to travel through corporate channels and back, we may not have a person left to revive by the time it arrives. The argument that followed was long, tense, and ultimately decided not by Voss's authority, but by a vote of the people actually present in that corridor, 4-1, with only Voss dissenting and Rosa siding firmly with Myra on the grounds that, in her words, nobody left behind, not even 11,000 years behind. The warden, for its part, offered what limited guidance it could, walking Alu and Farid through a slow and painstaking revival sequence that took the better part of another full day. The cryo ring's ancient systems groaning back to partial life one subsystem at a time, like a body remembering how to move after a long illness. The occupant, when the unit's frost-clouded lid finally hissed open, was a woman who looked no older than 30, her dark hair cropped short in a style that echoed nothing currently fashionable and yet felt, oddly, timeless. She drew a first ragged bee wreath, coughed hard enough to double over, and then looked up at the strangers gathered around her with eyes that held 11,000 years of unasked questions behind them. Report, she rasped, out of some deep and unbreakable instinct, before her mind had even fully caught up to where or who she was. Status. Is the anomaly contained? You're safe, Myra said gently, kneeling beside her. You're safe, but I need you to tell me your name. The woman's eyes focused slowly, taking in the unfamiliar faces, the unfamiliar cut of their clothing, the subtle strangeness of a room she clearly recognized, and yet somehow did not. Lieutenant Commander Wren Ilic, she said. Systems and Containment Specialist, Installation Palehound. Where is Captain Air? Where's the rest of my unit? Nobody answered right away, because nobody yet had the heart to be the one who explained to her exactly how much time had actually passed, and exactly what that meant. If this discovery is pulling you in the way it pulled in everyone standing in that cryo chamber, now is a good moment to hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't yet, and leave a comment telling me what you think Wren Ilic will do when she finally understands how long she's been asleep. I read every theory, and this story still has a long way left to go, so let's get back into it. The hours immediately following revival were, by every account Dale later heard, the hardest anyone in that medical bay had ever sat through. Wren's body, for all the cryo unit's careful preservation, had not woken easily. Her muscles fought against simple movement like limbs relearning a forgotten language, and twice in the first night she startled upright out of a shallow, fitful sleep, calling out designations and coordinates that meant nothing to the researchers monitoring her vitals, but had clearly once meant the difference between her crew's survival and its failure. Prio took the overnight watch on the second night, mostly because he could not bring himself to leave, and later admitted to Myra that he had spent most of it simply talking to her in a low, steady voice about nothing in particular. The weather on the surface, the way the mining crews joked around during shift changes, small, ordinary human details that seemed, somehow, to settle her more than any medical sedative could have. It took nearly 2 more days for Wren to stabilize enough, physically and mentally, to hear the truth in full, and Myra insisted on being the one to tell her, sitting across a small medical bay table with a patience that Dale privately admired more than he said aloud. Wren took the news the way a trained officer takes bad news in the field, with a controlled stillness that Dale suspected was doing an enormous amount of quiet, invisible work to hold back something much larger underneath. 11,000 years, she repeated, staring at her own hands as though checking they still belonged to her. Everyone I knew, everyone I served with, my family, if I still have any distant descendants left at all, they're not even a memory anymore. They're not even history. We're not even history. We're nothing. You're not nothing, Rosa said, with a bluntness that somehow landed more gently than any careful reassurance could have. You're the first proof anybody's had in 11,000 years that any of it was real. That's not nothing. That's everything. Wren was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally spoke again, her voice had steadied into something closer to the composed officer she must once have been. Tell me what you know. All of it. Because if I'm the last one who remembers what we were actually protecting against, then I need to know exactly how much of that job is still unfinished. Between Wren's fragmented but increasingly clear memories and the warden's archived records, the shape of the old crisis began to emerge with a clarity that no dry historical account could ever have matched. The anomaly Installation Palehound had been built to watch, Wren explained, had first been detected not as a black hole at all, but as a gravitational signature behaving in ways no natural collapse should behave, accelerating in pulses rather than a smooth curve, as though something inside it were making decisions. We called it the Hollow, Wren said. Not officially, that was just what the crews started calling it, because staring at its readings for months at a time does something to a person's nerves. Command's official theory was that it had been artificially seeded, engineered deliberately by something, though we never determined by whom or why. 17 listening posts were built around its projected zone of influence, Palehound among them, because whatever built it had left behind other structures too, half-buried, scattered across a handful of nearby systems, structures none of us could fully translate, and none of us could confirm were the same age as the anomaly itself. Other structu, Ray's Prio said, leaning forward despite himself, not human ones. We never confirmed that, Wren said. That was the maddening part of the whole assignment. Every scrap of evidence pointed towards something that had been there long before us, and every attempt to communicate with it, if there was ever anything there capable of communication at all, went unanswered. We didn't know if we were watching a weapon, a mistake, or a grave. We only knew it was growing, and Command wanted eyes on it at all times in case it grew fast enough to become everyone's problem. Then it did, the warden said quietly, its synthetic voice carrying a weight it had not shown before. Or Command believed it had. My final transmission indicated the anomaly's growth rate had spiked far beyond every projected model in the space of 11 days. 6 of the 17 listening posts lost contact with Command in that same window. Captain Ayer made the decision to seal this installation rather than risk evacuation through space our instruments could no longer reliably chart. Wren closed her eyes briefly. Selene, she said, using the captain's given name with the ease of someone who had served under her for years. She always said she'd rather freeze the whole crew alive than gamble our lives on numbers she couldn't trust. I suppose she meant that more literally than either of us realized at the time. It was Wren, more than anyone, who insisted they proceed to Bay 7 immediately, moving with an urgency that came less from scientific curiosity and more from a soldier's need to finish an assignment 11,000 years overdue. The passage there took them through the memorial wall near the bay's entrance, its carved and enduring phrase catching the light exactly as it had the first time Dale's team had passed it, for those who watched so others could sleep. And Wren stopped in front of it for a long, silent moment, her hand pressed flat against the cold alloy, before she allowed herself to keep moving. Bay 7 itself, when they reached it, took Dale's breath away in a way that no mining discovery in his career ever had. The vessel docked within was sleek and dark, built along lines that felt both utterly foreign and unmistakably, achingly human. The same instinct for grace under function that Dale had seen in every generation of human-designed ship since, as if some fundamental sensibility about beauty and purpose had survived even the loss of every explicit memory of these people who built it. "Threnodi's watch," Wren said, reading the hull markings with something between recognition and grief. "Emergency, evacuation, and archive vessel. I trained on her simulator for 6 months before I was ever cleared to set foot inside the real thing. Selene used to joke that if we ever actually had to use her for real, it would mean we'd already lost." "Vessel designation, Threnodi's watch," the warden confirmed as the bay's ancient lights flickered on, one by one, illuminating a hull that gleamed as though it had been sealed in a vacuum untouched by time, which, Dale realized, it essentially had been. "Power reserves at 6% and declining. I recommend immediate connection to installation reserves if you intend to access its systems, or the data within may be lost within days." Myra was already moving toward the access ramp, Prio close behind her with a portable diagnostic kit, the two of them momentarily united by the same electric urgency, the shared understanding that they were standing at the edge of a discovery that would rewrite everything humanity believed about its own past. Dale followed, and Rosa brought up the rear, rifle finally lowered all the way, because whatever danger this place had once represented, it was clear now that danger was not what remained. Wren walked beside them not as a visitor, but as crew returning to a post she had never truly left, and Voss trailed at the back of the group, quieter now than he had been at any point since the discovery began, though whether that quiet came from awe or continued calculation, Dale honestly could not say. Inside the vessel, the air was colder still, and the corridors narrower, built for efficiency rather than comfort. They found the archive chamber at the ship's heart, a room lined with storage cores similar to the warden's own housing, and Prio knelt before the central console with the reverent care of a man handling something sacred. "Power's low but stable," he reported after several tense minutes of work. "I can route a feed from my suit's reserve cell. It won't run long, but it should be enough to pull the primary logs." The logs, when they finally loaded onto the console's cracked display, told a story more intimate and more devastating than any dry historical record could have managed. They were the final entries of the installation's last commanding officer, a woman named Captain Selene Ilic, recorded in the days and hours before the transmission that sent Palehound into its long, unanswered sleep. Her voice, recovered and replayed through the console's failing speakers, was steady in the way that only comes from someone determined not to let fear show through, even when the fear was fully justified. She spoke of the anomaly accelerating far beyond every projection command had prepared them for, of contact lost with 6 of the 17 listening posts within a single week, of a decision made in her final hours to seal Palehound rather than risk evacuation through space that had become, in her words, unpredictable in ways our instruments cannot fully chart, and I will not gamble my crew's lives on a bet I cannot calculate the odds of. There were earlier logs too, entries stretching back months before the crisis reached its final pitch, and Prio pulled a handful of them up in sequence, letting Captain Ider's voice narrate the slow tightening of a noose none of her crew had fully seen coming. In one entry, recorded what the timestamp indicated was nearly a full year before the end, She described the discovery of the alien structures Wren had mentioned, her tone equal parts fascination and unease. Whatever built these markers wasn't human and wasn't recent, Iger's recorded voice said. The engineering is elegant in a way that makes our own containment protocols look like guesswork. I don't know if they were warning something away or warning something in. I don't know if we're standing in the middle of a fence or a grave or a cage. I only know that whatever built it was not confident enough in its permanence to leave it unattended, and neither am I. There was a third entry, tucked between the two Prio had already pulled, that none of them expected to affect them as much as it did. It was shorter than the others, recorded, according to the timestamp, on what would have been an ordinary rotation with nothing extraordinary logged before or after it, and Iger's tone in it was almost conversational, stripped of the careful command formality she wore in every other recording. "Ran into Wren in the mess hall tonight," the recording said, and Dale saw Wren's whole body go rigid at the sound of her own name spoken from a voice 11,000 years gone. She'd been running containment simulations for 16 hours straight and looked like she hadn't slept in a week, which, knowing her, she probably hadn't. I told her to go rest. She told me the Hollow doesn't rest, so neither would she. I made her go anyway. That's the job sometimes, not just watching the anomaly, but watching each other, making sure none of us disappears into the watching so completely that there's no one left to come home to, if we ever do get to go home. I don't know what's out there in that dark. I do know what's in here in this crew, and some days that's the only math that actually holds steady. End log. Wren did not speak for a long time after that recording ended. When she finally did, her voice was thick in a way none of them had heard from her since the moment she woke. "She always did that," Wren said. "Made you rest whether you wanted to or not. I forgot that. 11,000 years and cryo strips out the small things first, the ordinary things, and you don't even notice they're gone until something hands them back to you all at once." She wiped her face with the back of her sleeve, quick and almost embarrassed by it, and nodded once at Prio to keep going. In a later entry, recorded roughly 2 months before the end, Itter's voice carried a new and heavier weight. "Command's asking us to hold position regardless of risk assessment. I understand the strategic necessity. I don't love it. My crew didn't sign up to be the last line between the rest of humanity and something none of us fully understand. But they'll hold because that's what we do, and because the alternative is worse. I just hope somebody remembers eventually that we chose to stay." Myra had tears on her face by the time the final recording ended, and she did nothing to hide them. Dale found his own throat tight in a way he had not expected from a mining survey gone strange. Even Rosa, who had built her whole career on maintaining a professional stillness in the face of danger, stood with her jaw clenched and her eyes fixed on the middle distance, as though giving herself a moment before she trusted her voice. Wren, standing closest to the console, said nothing at all, her hand resting lightly against the archive casing, as though it were a shoulder she could still reach across 11,000 years to touch. "What happened to the anomaly?" Voss asked quietly, and for once there was no calculation in his voice at all, only the plain human need to know how the story ended. The warden answered from a nearby speaker, its tone gentler now than it had been at the start of their encounter, as though the act of finally sharing its long-held burden had changed something in whatever passed for its temperament. "I have read the final trajectory data in Captain Iger's logs against modern astronomical surveys accessible through this installation's passive sensors, which have continued limited operation throughout my dormancy. I believe I have located the anomaly's current position." A new projection bloomed above the console, a star map spanning hundreds of light years, and at its center, marked in a stark red that needed no further explanation, sat a small, dense point of gravitational distortion that current colonial astronomy cataloged under a mundane technical designation, filed away as nothing more than an unremarkable stellar remnant, unworthy of further study. "It is still there," the warden said. "It has not expanded in the manner Captain Iger feared it might. Current data suggests its growth rate slowed dramatically several thousand years after the last transmission, for reasons I cannot determine from this installation alone. It is possible that whatever mechanism caused its initial acceleration ceased to function. It is possible that it was never truly a threat to expand indefinitely, and the crisis that ended an entire era of human history was, in some terrible irony, ultimately unnecessary. I do not have sufficient data to know for certain. I have only had 11,000 years to wonder. It didn't slow down on its own, Wren said suddenly, and every head in the chamber turned toward her. I remember something. It's fragmented. Cryo does that to memory, pulls things apart and doesn't always put them back cleanly. But I remember a final transmission from one of the other listening posts, Post 11, received just before Selene made the call to seal us. They reported the anomaly's pulses had started synchronizing with something. Some kind of external signal, not one of ours. Whatever built those alien markers Selene mentioned in her log, I think it came back. I think it did something. I don't think it was random that the growth stopped. The chamber went very still. Are you saying, Myra said slowly, that something intelligent intervened? That whatever built the anomaly or the structures around it came back and stabilized it on purpose? I'm saying it's the only theory that ever made sense to me, Wren said. Even 11,000 years ago, when I first heard that fragment of the report, Selene didn't believe it. She thought it was wishful thinking from an exhausted crew looking for any reason to hope. But I always wondered. Nobody in the chamber had an answer to that, and for a long moment the only sound was the faint electronic hum of the console, patient and indifferent to the enormity of what it had just revealed. The interruption came 3 days later, and it came, predictably, from a direction none of them had bothered to watch closely enough. A corporate transport dropped out of orbit without the usual courtesy of an advance signal, and the woman who disembarked introduced herself as Chief Regional Officer Talia Renfrew, sent directly from Ashgrove Sector Headquarters the moment Voss's initial, cautious disclosure report had reached executive channels. She toured the excavation site with a brisk, appraising efficiency that reminded Dale uncomfortably of the way Voss himself had first regarded the wall, except sharper, less conflicted, entirely certain of what she wanted. This installation sits on Ashgrove leased mineral rights, Renfrew said, standing in the very chamber where the warden's pedestal glowed its quiet blue light, as though the machine listening to her were nothing more than an inconvenient fixture. Whatever historical value it holds, the underlying claim belongs to this company, and I intend to see that claim protected. I've already authorized a full extraction and cataloging team from corporate research. Your improvised commission proposal, Director Voss, is hereby superseded. With respect, Officer Renfrew, Voss said, and Dale watched the effort it visibly cost him to hold his ground against someone who, until recently, would have simply been his superior to obey without question. There's a living human being from this installation currently under our care. There are archives here documenting the near-total loss of an entire prior human civilization. That is not a mineral asset. That is not something Ashgrove gets to catalog and license. Everything on a company lease is a company asset until a court says otherwise, Renfrew said flatly. And courts move slowly. We'll have this facility fully surveyed and its more valuable technologies transferred off-world long before any government commission finishes its paperwork. It was Wren, standing quietly near the back of the chamber through the entire exchange, who finally stepped forward, and something in the set of her shoulders made even Renfrew pause. I served under United Earth Defense Command, Wren said, her voice carrying the flat, unmistakable authority of someone who had once given orders to frighten people in far worse circumstances than this. I do not recognize your company's claim to anything inside these walls, because your company did not build them, did not die defending them, and did not wait 11,000 years to be found. I am the last surviving officer of this installation, and until a legitimate government authority tells me otherwise, I consider myself still in command of what happens here." Renfrew opened her mouth to reply, then closed it again, visibly recalculating. Whatever answer her corporate training had prepared her to give clearly did not account for the possibility of being addressed, in person, by a woman who predated the entire concept of Ashgrove Extractive Holdings by 10,000 years. "That's an unusual legal position," she said finally, more carefully than before. "It's not a legal position," Wren said. "It's the only thing I have left. You can bring your lawyers. I'll still be standing here when they arrive, and so will everyone who chooses to stand with me." Myra, Prio, Rosa, Farid, and Alu all moved to stand beside her without a word being spoken between them. A small, ragged line of people who had spent the last weeks becoming something closer to family than colleagues. Dale, after only a moment's hesitation, stepped forward as well. Voss looked at Renfrew, looked at the line of people facing her down, and made in that instant the final and most consequential decision of his career. "I'm filing my report with the Interstellar Heritage Registry this afternoon," he said, "recommending immediate protected status for this site under Wartime Memorial Statute, effective before any extraction team of yours can set foot inside. I'd rather lose my position than my conscience, Officer Renfrew, and at this point I suspect I'm about to lose both, so I may as well choose which one goes first." Renfrew left within the hour, and the legal battle that followed dragged on for months, fought across 3 separate colonial courts, and no small amount of public sentiment that turned, decisively and almost immediately, against Ashgrove the moment word of Wren's survival and Captain Igor's final recordings reached the wider press. It was, in the end, Wren's own recorded testimony, calm, unflinching, utterly without theatrics, that swayed the deciding tribunal more than any lawyer's argument managed to. She did not ask for sympathy. She asked only that the people who had died holding a line nobody living had known needed holding be allowed, finally, to rest with the dignity they had earned rather than being quietly converted into a line item on a corporate ledger. It was Voss, unexpectedly, who broke the silence in that first chamber, days before Renfrew's arrival, before any of them yet knew the fight that was coming, and what he said surprised every person present, including Dale suspected Voss himself. "If that's true," he said quietly, "then this isn't just a historical discovery. It's a live diplomatic situation. There might be someone or something still out there that we owe a conversation to. That's not a mining problem. That's not even an archaeology problem. That's the biggest problem any of us has ever stood next to." "Since when do you care about anything that doesn't have a market value, Director?" Rosa asked, not unkindly, but not gently either. Voss was quiet for a moment before he answered, and when he did, there was an honesty in his voice that Dale had never heard from him before. "Since I stood in a cryo chamber and watched a woman wake up 11,000 years after everyone she ever loved was already dust. Some things put a number this large in front of you, and the number stops meaning anything at all. I still have a job to do, but I know the difference between a mineral vein and this. I've known it since the moment that wall cracked open." It took the better part of the following week for the team to fully catalog what remained of Installation Palehound, the warden guiding them patiently through archive after archive, each revealing another fragment of the lost expansion's final months, supply manifests, personal letters recorded for families who would never receive them, technical schematics for defense systems that Alu Nakamura quietly admitted were decades, possibly centuries, beyond anything colonial engineering currently fielded. Voss, true to the promise he had made in Bay 7, filed a report to Ashgrove Extractive Holdings that, for the first time in his career, prioritized disclosure over exploitation, recommending the site be handed over to a joint scientific and governmental commission rather than quietly stripped for salvage rights. It cost him, later, more than he ever admitted aloud: a demotion, a transfer, a quiet erosion of the career he had built, but he never once said he regretted it. Wren Ilic chose to stay on Kesari 9 rather than attempt any kind of reintegration into a wider colonial society that held nothing familiar to her at all, working alongside Myra and the growing research team as the only living bridge between the world they knew and the one Palehound had guarded. She struggled, in the early months, in ways nobody fully saw and few ever asked her to explain. Waking some nights certain she could still hear Captain Ader's voice down some corridor that no longer existed, reaching for people who had been gone so long that grief itself had nowhere left to land. But she stayed because, as she told Myra quietly one evening months into the work, someone from that crew needs to finish the job. It might as well be the one who's still breathing. The Joint Commission's deeper survey of the science wing, conducted over the following year with Wren serving as lead consultant, eventually turned up something that reopened the entire question of the alien structures Captain Ader had once described with such uneasy fascination. Buried in a secondary archive that the original breach team had missed entirely, Alu Nakamura found a partial technical translation, painstakingly assembled by Palehound's original science staff over what must have been years of patient, frustrated effort, of a fragment of inscription recovered from one of those unidentified markers. It was incomplete, riddled with untranslatable gaps, but the portion that did resolve into coherent meaning sent a quiet shock through the entire research community when it was finally released to the public. The fragment, rendered as closely as the original scientists had been able to manage, read simply, "Containment is not cruelty. We watched this wound so it would not spread. We will watch it still, long after you have forgotten our watching, because forgetting does not end a duty, it only makes the duty lonelier." They were doing exactly what we were doing, Wren said quietly, the day the translation was confirmed, standing in front of a projection of the fragment in the same chamber where the warden's pedestal still glowed. Whoever they were, watching something so it wouldn't spread. Maybe they'd been doing it a lot longer than us. Maybe that's why the anomaly stabilized. Maybe they just came back to check on their own fence line, the way Seleni's people came back to check on theirs, and found out somebody new had shown up beside them, trying to help hold it. Nobody could confirm the theory, and the Joint Commission was careful, in every public statement that followed, not to overstate a conclusion the evidence could not yet fully support. But the open invitation broadcast toward the anomaly's coordinates continued, patient and unhurried, and in the years that followed, 3 of the 16 recovered Palehound installations began registering faint, structured energy readings from deep space that no one could yet explain, readings that arrived on no predictable schedule and carried no decipherable content, but that arrived nonetheless, like something distant choosing, very slowly, to notice that it had finally been noticed back. It took the better part of 2 years after that for the full weight of the discovery to ripple outward from Kesari 9 into every corner of colonial civilization. The data recovered from Threnodi's watch and the warden's own archives rewrote university textbooks, upended the assumptions of a dozen academic disciplines, and forced an uncomfortable but ultimately necessary reckoning with the idea that humanity's story was longer, stranger, and more resilient than anyone had dared imagine. That this was not humanity's first attempt at the stars, but its second. Built quietly and without memory on the foundation of a civilization that had given everything to hold a line nobody living had ever known needed holding. A joint commission, formed from representatives of 6 colonial governments and staffed heavily with researchers Myra herself helped select, took over long-term stewardship of the anomaly's monitoring, this time with full public knowledge, and at Wren's insistence, an open-standing invitation broadcast toward the anomaly's coordinates on a slow, patient repeating loop, in case whatever had once stabilized it was still listening, still watching, still willing after all this time to finally answer. Myra Kess left her position at Ashgrove Extractive Holdings within the year, taking up a research post dedicated entirely to Palehound and its sister installations, 16 of which were eventually located and in 4 cases, found still faintly, stubbornly alive, waiting in their own patient darkness, though none held another survivor quite like Wren. Dale Osai stayed on as foreman, though he privately admitted to anyone who asked that mining had never felt quite the same since, that every drill bit striking rock now carried the faint electric possibility of striking history instead. Rosa Aldicott took a permanent security posting at the Palehound site and made a habit, every year on the anniversary of the breach, of standing quietly before the memorial wall with its carved and enduring phrase, saying nothing at all, because some things did not need to be said aloud to be honored. Tan, who had once dreamed of standing at the center of first contact, found something he considered even better, a career spent cataloging the echoes of a civilization that had come before, giving names and context back to people who had waited 11,000 years simply to be remembered at all. The warden remained where it had always been, its power reserves finally restored to full capacity through a permanent connection to modern colonial infrastructure, its purpose at last complete and yet, in its own way, only beginning anew. It had spent 11,000 years alone in the dark, faithfully guarding a secret it had never wanted to keep, waiting for someone, anyone, to finally come and let it put its burden down. On quiet evenings, when the research staff had gone for the day and the installation's corridors fell into their familiar hush, it was said that the warden would sometimes speak, unprompted, to no one in particular, running a fragment of Captain Igor's final recording on a loop through the empty chamber, her voice steady and certain, still promising to whoever might one day listen that Palehound had held, that they had held as long as they possibly could, and that hope, buried deep enough and built to last, could survive even the complete erasure of the people who first carried it. Wren visited that chamber often in those quiet evenings, and would sit beside the pedestal with the same stillness she had once held during long watches over the hollow, listening to her captain's voice as though it were a conversation still ongoing, one she fully intended to finish, however long it took. Dale found her there one evening, nearly 3 years after the breach, sitting cross-legged on the cold alloy floor with a mug of something warm going cold in her hands, watching the pedestal's soft light the way some people watched a fire. He almost turned back without disturbing her, but she waved him in without looking up. "You ever think about how strange it is," she said, "that the thing that finally ended our watch wasn't a weapon or a battle or even the anomaly itself? It was a mining rig. Something so ordinary it barely made the news on your worlds until it broke through into ours." "I think about it most days," Dale admitted, settling onto the floor beside her, his knees protesting the whole way down. 22 years running rigs, and the one time it actually mattered, I almost sealed the shaft back up and called it a routine or fault. Voss nearly made me do exactly that." "I'm glad you didn't." Wren was quiet for a moment, turning the mug slowly in her hands. "Selene used to say that the universe doesn't send you rescue in the shape you expect. She meant it about supply ships and reinforcements, back when we still thought rescue was coming at all. I don't think she ever imagined it would come 11,000 years late, driven by someone drilling for iron ore who had never even heard her name." A faint, wry smile crossed her face. She would have found that unbearably funny, honestly. She had that kind of humor, the kind that shows up right when everything's the most serious, because otherwise the seriousness eats you alive. "What do you think she'd say," Dale asked, "if she could see all this now? The commission, the broadcast, everything." Wren considered the question with the same careful weight she gave to everything, a habit Dale suspected she would never fully lose, cryo or no cryo, 11,000 years or no 11,000 years. "I think she'd tell us not to get comfortable," she said finally. "I think she'd say the watch isn't over just because somebody finally noticed we were watching. I think she'd be proud and worried in exactly equal measure because that's what command always felt like for her. And then I think she'd tell everyone to get back to work, because standing around admiring the view never once solved a containment problem." She laughed, quiet and a little rough, and for the first time since Dale had known her, the laugh reached all the way to her eyes. the Joint Commission's newest listening posts, built along more modern lines but staffed, at Wren's insistence, with a permanent human presence rather than automated systems alone, went active in orbit around the anomaly's outer edge later that same year. Their first official transmission, a simple, deliberately worded message broadcast on the same patient loop the warden had once maintained alone in the dark. This line is still held, and it is watched now with open eyes by people who choose to remember. Whoever or whatever is listening is welcome to answer, whenever you are ready and for however long that takes. Myra Kess left her position at Ashgrove Extractive Holdings within the year, taking up a research post dedicated entirely to Palehound and its sister installations, 16 of which were eventually located and, in 4 cases, found still faintly, stubbornly alive, waiting in their own patient darkness, though none held another survivor quite like Wren. Dale Ose stayed on as foreman, though he privately admitted to anyone who asked that mining had never felt quite the same since, that every drill bit striking rock now carried the faint electric possibility of striking history instead. Rosa Aldicott took a permanent security posting at the Palehound site and made a habit, every year on the anniversary of the breach, of standing quietly before the memorial wall with its carved and enduring phrase, saying nothing at all, because some things did not need to be said aloud to be honored. Priotan, who had once dreamed of standing at the center of first contact, found something he considered even better: a career spent cataloging the echoes of a civilization that had come before, giving names and context back to people who had waited 11,000 years simply to be remembered at all. Voss, stripped of his corporate title within a year of the Renfrew confrontation, took a quieter administrative post within the new commission itself, and told Myra once, half joking, that it was the first job he'd ever held where he actually liked the person he saw in the mirror each morning. And somewhere out past the edge of charted space, in the cold dark where a gravitational anomaly no longer grew, a signal repeated patiently on a loop, reaching toward whatever had once answered a crisis 11,000 years old, carrying not a warning this time, but an invitation and the quiet, stubborn hope that somewhere, something was still listening back.